Great. So welcome to the second lecture of Week 3 of Philosophy 1500.02, Introduction to Logic Online. In this lecture, which corresponds to Chapter 1.5 in the book, we're going to be talking about countermodels or counterexamples. Right. So these are ways of showing that arguments are invalid. Right. So we're going to start off by a quick review of argumentative form, which you should have covered already in Week 3, Lecture 1. And then we're going to turn to the method of counterexamples or countermodels. All right. Right, so we've already covered what the big idea behind argumentative form and substitution instances is, and it's this, right? So we can show that arguments with the same form are invalid by producing a substitution instance of that argument where their premises are true and the conclusion is false. Or rather, where its premises are true and the conclusion is false. Right. So in the last lecture, right, we talked about argumentative form. Right. The idea here is that arguments have something in common. Right. Namely, the form. Right. So arguments of the form if P then Q, P, Q all share the same form. Right. And we talked about how different arguments are substitution instances of the same form. Right. So the big idea here, right, is that we can use this sort of fact, right, to show that arguments are invalid, right? So very important, I have it here in all capital letters, you cannot use this method to determine if an argument is valid, right? And we'll talk about that as we go on. But for now, right, the big idea, right, you should be familiar with argumentative form and substitution instances, right? And we're going to use that to show that arguments are invalid if they are invalid. Right. And again, you can't use it to determine if an argument is valid. Right. And again, we'll talk about why that is. All right. So here's sort of what we're going to do. Right. 3 steps. Good. Okay. So first step. Right. We're going to identify the form of a given invalid argument. Right. So how this is going to work, I'm going to give you an argument. I'm going to tell you that it's invalid, and then I'm going to ask you to prove that it's invalid. Right. Using a counterexample or a countermodel. Right. So first step, identify the form of a given invalid argument. Second step, construct substitution instances or a substitution instance with true premises and a false conclusion. Right. So let's think about why we're doing that, and this will bring us into step 3. Right. So we want to show that the argument's invalid. Right. So if we have a substitution instance where the premises are true and the conclusion is false, right, if all arguments of the same argumentative form, right, are either valid or invalid, right, then if you can construct a substitution instance of a given form, right, where the premises are true and the conclusion is false, right, you'll have shown that the original argument, right, with that same form is invalid, right? And why is that? Well, here's where we appeal to the definitions of validity and invalidity. Remember, an argument is valid if and only if it's not possible for its premises to be true and its conclusion false, and it's invalid otherwise. That is, it's invalid if and only if it's not valid. So if we can construct a substitution instance of a given argumentative form, right, that's invalid, right, then we can show that that form, right, is invalid. Not just that argument, but that form, right, the form of the argument, right, and we can also show that the given argument that we began with, right, is invalid. Right, so here's an example of how this will work, right? So I give you an argument. So the following argument is invalid, right? Some cats are furry things. Some furry things are canines. Therefore, some cats are canines, right? So convince yourself that this is invalid. Well, note that the first premise is true, right? Some cats are furry things. Note that the second premise is in fact true. Some furry things are canines, right? So perhaps you have a dog that's furry. So of the furry things, one of them is at least a canine, right? And then the conclusion, some cats are canines. Well, we know that to be false, right? So we know that this argument is invalid, right? Because it's possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion actually false. We know that it's possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false, right? Because the premises are actually true and the conclusion is actually false, right? So you should have been able to be convinced or convince yourself that this is an invalid argument. But what we want to do is prove, perhaps with some other argument with the same form, that it's invalid, right? And to do that, we're going to construct a counterexample or a countermodel, right, and go from there. So remember, what we need to do here, right, is identify the form of this given invalid argument. Second, we need to construct a substitution instance of this argumentative form with true premises and a false conclusion, right? And then we need to appeal to definitions of validity and invalidity, right? So let's sort of think about what we're doing here. So we know that this argument is invalid, right? And we've already given like the explanation of why it's invalid, but it's not always the case, right, that the premises and the conclusion of an invalid argument are actually true and then false respectively, right? There are some invalid arguments, remember, where the premises are true and the conclusion is true, right? But if the premises are true, the conclusion doesn't have to be true, right? So there are invalid arguments with true premises and a true conclusion, right? So we couldn't go through the sort of reasoning that we just went through with respect to this argument where the premises are actually true and the conclusion is actually false, right? So there is actually like a use for this then, right? Because it's not always obvious that an argument is invalid, or at least it's not always obvious that we have an invalid instance of the argument that shows us that it's invalid, right? So that's what we're up to here. Right, so here's step one. This sort of thing should be familiar from last time, right? Remember, we're going to go through and we're going to like similarly highlight the sort of frame of the argument. So here, some are. Note that each sentence or each premise in the conclusion has the form some blank are blank. Right, so look at the slide to confirm this. Next, we can go through and start highlighting terms, right? So in this case, cats. Note that cats appears in the first slot of the first premise and in the first slot of the conclusion. And now we can highlight furry things, right? So second slot of first premise, first slot of second premise, doesn't appear in the conclusion. And then finally, canines, right? Good. Right, so we've identified the form of this given invalid argument, right? And we do that like this, right? So we're going to uniformly replace the terms with variables. So I think sometimes it makes sense to use letters that have something to do with the words, maybe in fact the letter that begins the word. So in this case, I've chosen C for cat. So every time I see cats, I'll put a C. Right, I've chosen F for furry things. Every time I see furry things, I'll use an F. And then finally, I've used dogs for canines. Well, why is that? Well, canines are dogs. Actually, I think I said I used dogs for canines. I used D for canines. Right, so that gives us the following argumentative form. Some C are F, some F are D, therefore some C are D. And if you'll recall from last time, it doesn't matter really what variables you use. Just so long as you use them uniformly, right? So you could have used X, Y, and Z, right? So in place where I have C, you might have put X. In places where I have F, you might have put Y. And in places where I have D, you might have put Z, right? And that would give you some X or Y, some Y or Z, therefore some X or Z, right? It doesn't matter, again, what the particular variables are, just so long as you distribute them appropriately in the form. Right, so if you had something like some F are C, some F are D, therefore some C are D, that would be a different form. Okay, so now we're on to step two, right, where we're constructing substitution instances, or a substitution instance of this rather, where the premises are true and the conclusion is false. So again, let's sort of reiterate why we're doing this, right? We want to show that the argumentative form is invalid. Right, and to show that, right, we need to produce an instance of the argumentative form that is a substitution instance of the argumentative form where the premises are true and the conclusion is false, right? If we can produce such an instance, right, then we can prove that the argument is invalid, right, because an argument is valid if and only if it's not possible for its premises to be true and its conclusion false at the same time, and otherwise, right, it's invalid, right? So if we can produce an instance of this argument where the premises are true, right, and the conclusion is false, right, then we can show that the argument's invalid. So there's a missing step here, right, and you might remember this from last time. So the missing step here, right, is that arguments with the same form are either all valid or all invalid, right, so that's why this works, right, so we had our argument that we began with about cats and furry things and canines, right? We walked through an argument to show you that that was invalid, but suppose you didn't know that, right? You wanted to figure out whether the argument was invalid, but you suspect it is, right? So you find the form of the argument, right? The argumentative form, that's step one. Step two, we're constructing a substitution instance with true premises and a false conclusion. And then ideally that will show that this particular argument, right, is invalid, right? But then how does that apply to the original argument? Well, the missing step again is that all arguments with the same form are either valid or invalid, right? So if you can show of this form that it has an invalid substitution instance, right, then any argument that has that form is invalid, right? So that's what we're doing here. All right, so back to step two, we have our argumentative form, some C or F, some F or D, therefore some C or D, right? And we want to produce a substitution instance with true premises and a false conclusion. So unfortunately, there's no foolproof way to do this, right? There's no sort of like method you can follow. If you do it enough, you get good at it, or you get better at it at least. But again, what we're looking for is true premises and a false conclusion, right? So one thing you can do it with that sort of restricts the range of things you have to look for are like mathematical notions. So like even, odd, prime, composite, integer, real, stuff like that. So if you're familiar with that, I would suggest using that. If you're not familiar with it, it's just another thing to learn. Don't do it that way. Do things with like children and dogs and French people. But here's a substitution instance of our argumentative form that I submit the premises are obviously true and the conclusion is obviously false, right? So that shows that the argument has true premises and a false conclusion, right? So it's possible for it to have false premises or true premises and a false conclusion. So the argument's invalid, right? So before giving you the actual argument, although you've probably read it by now, it's on the screen. One thing I want to mention is when you're doing this, right, make sure that you choose the values of your terms or of your sentences in such a way that it's obvious, right, to any sort of like normal person that the premises are true and the conclusion's false, right? So if you say something like, I had oats for breakfast this morning, I have no way to know whether that's true, right? But here, it needs to be obvious, right? And I submit that this is obvious. So here we go. Some children are French people. Some French people are adults. Therefore, some children are adults. Right. First premise checks out, obviously true. Second premise checks out, obviously true. Conclusion check. Well, it doesn't check out. It's obviously false, right? No children no child rather is an adult. So some children aren't adults. Or rather, it's not the case that some children are adults, right? No children are adults. So good. So what does this show? Well, this is a substitution instance of the argumentative form. It's clearly invalid because its premises are true and its conclusion's false, right? So any argument that has this same argumentative form is invalid. All right. So just to reiterate, this is clearly a substitution instance, right? If you've printed these out, you can highlight it, compare it to the earlier highlighted thing. But I'm going to take it that at this point you see that it is a substitution instance. All right. And it clearly has true premises and a false conclusion. All right. So here's what we need to do to sort of finish everything off. Right. We need to appeal to definitions of validity and invalidity, right? And then facts about argumentative form. Okay. So here's a sample thing that would be a good thing to write if I were to ask you, hint, I will ask you to construct a counterexample or countermodel and explain why it shows that a particular argument is invalid, right? So there, meaning above, is a substitution instance of the original argument's form with true premises and a false conclusion. Right? An argument's valid if and only if it's not possible for its premises to be true and its conclusion false at the same time. And an argument is invalid if and only if it's not valid. So the substitution instance we produced is invalid, right? This is the one about children and French people and adults, right? Arguments with the same form are all either valid or invalid, right? This argument is invalid, right? So the argument we began with is invalid, or rather, the substitution instance we produced is invalid. So the argument we began with, right, the one above about cats and furry things and canines, right, is invalid as well. So let's have another example, right? So suppose I tell you the following is an invalid argument. Some smiths are not meticulous people. Some meticulous people are not paid laborers. Therefore, some smiths are not paid laborers. I don't know. I don't know whether or not all these premises are true and the conclusion's false. It doesn't really matter, right? I tell you it's invalid. We need to show that it's invalid. So what I'd suggest doing now is trying to do what we've done, right? So maybe pause me, try to show that this is invalid by producing a counterexample or a countermodel. All right, so I hope that you've done it. So far, the first step, right, is to identify the form of a given invalid argument. Here's our invalid argument. Here's the form of the argument. Some S are not M, some M are not P, some S are not P. Right? Do you see how I got that? Right? So the sort of stuff we want to keep, right, is what all of the claims have in common, right? At least in this case, so some are not, some are not, some are not, right? And we uniformly replace smiths and meticulous people and paid laborers with S, M, and P respectively. And that gives us this. All right, so our second step is to construct a substitution instance of this argumentative form with true premises and a false conclusion. Try it, do it, really do it. Don't just take my word for it. You need to do it. You have to practice this. So please pause me now. Try to construct a substitution instance with true premises and a false conclusion. Once you've done it, turn this back on and we'll talk about it. This is for the people who we're just going to go through. All right, so I can't hold your hand. I hope that you've done it. Here's what I came up with. Remember, we're looking for a substitution instance where the premises are obviously true and the conclusion's obviously false. Oh, I see a typo. Oh, well. So here's what I came up with. Some students are not men. Some men are not pupils. Therefore, some students are not pupils. Right, so it's true that some students aren't men. Some are women. Right, and it's true that some men aren't pupils, right? They're, I don't know, not students, right? Perhaps they're lawyers or something, I don't know. Okay, so first, the premises are true, right? But what about the conclusion? Some students are not pupils. Well, that's obviously false, right? Any student is a pupil, and any pupil is a student. So true premises, false conclusion. So remember what we were doing in our second step is trying to find a substitution instance where we had obviously two true premises and an obviously false conclusion. This is what I came up with. I'd be interested in hearing what you came up with. I'd be interested in hearing if anyone failed to come up with anything, because yeah, we need to address that. But in any case, this is what I came up with. And now for step 3, right, we need to appeal to definitions of validity and invalidity, right, in order to show that our original argument, right, is invalid, right? So I've produced this instance of the argumentative form, right? It has true premises and a true conclusion, right? Remember, an argument's valid if and only if it's not possible for its premises to be true and its conclusion false at the same time, and an argument is invalid if and only if it's not valid, right? So the substitution instance we produced is invalid, right, because the premises are true and the conclusion's false, right? Arguments with the same form are all valid or invalid, right? So the argument we began with is invalid, right? Because this argument is invalid and it's a substitution instance of the form of the original argument. Okay, so that's what we're doing in this part of the course. I encourage you to look at some more examples. You'll have to do this on the quiz. In fact, you'll have to do like this very thing, right? You're going to have to write an explanation like the one I have here. So it would, I guess, behoove you to not memorize what I have there, but think about like how all the parts fit together and what parts you actually need, right? So good job. You've listened to both of the lectures for the week. Yeah, good luck. Let me know if you have any questions. I'm available to meet on campus if people want to do that, or I can meet with you over Skype or through the conference feature on Carmen. But please, please, please reach out to me. I have no way of really knowing how you're feeling about the material otherwise. Okay, cool. So see ya.